Welcome to attempt number 2 with a live streaming broadcast with Fred Harburg. He is with us now, and we're excited to have Fred share some of his experience with coaching models. Now, Fred has been the executive director of the executive development program at Kellogg out of Northwestern, along with many other roles where he was involved with and in charge of the development of people and organizations. Fred has been associated with coaching for a long, long time, and is actually was at the start and in the creation of several different very elegant coaching models that I'm sure many of you have heard of. So in this first of a series of interviews with Fred, we're going to explore some of the origins of those models. But look for upcoming live streams where Fred talks more about his experience with developing people and developing organizations. So Fred, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John. Good to be with you.
So tell me a little bit about, we've talked about this a little bit on our own, but tell me about your association with the development and creation of some of the coaching models that are out there.
Okay. Before we get into the models, I just want to say a couple of things first, and that is that I think the method of coaching is much more important than the model. So as we talk about models, what I'd say is that my own belief is that when we talk about the model, we're talking about the mechanics, we're talking about the specific way that the conversation is systematized. We're talking about the steps that people would take in pursuing the conversation. And while all of that is important, it's far less important than the relationship between the person being coached and the coach. And of course, as you know, I call that rapport. I call that relationship one of rapport. In fact, I use a metaphor that it is the music as opposed to the words. And so I simply want to emphasize before we talk about models at all, that I think the music is the thing that really creates the melody of this, sets the tone for it, has lasting value, and the specific model is of less importance, although it can be quite important for reasons that we'll talk about.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, as I was looking at different coaching models that I would use as I worked with organizations, your emphasis on the relationship, on the music, on the heart of the coach to be not about fixing or curing, but the idea of the thought partnership and the idea of building capacity and competency rather than solving problems. I thought that's one of the things that attracted me to your approach.
And we might talk about what I think is the core of coaching, because I think what coaching is all about is about helping people change their behavior to get better results. And if it doesn't accomplish that, if it doesn't help people change behavior, it could be technical behavior, it could be very interpersonal behavior, but unless a coaching process helps a person change their behavior to consistently get better results, then it's a waste of time. Or at least it may not be a complete waste of time, but it's certainly not as productive as it might be. So I think that's foundational. I just can't emphasize how important, and we might spend another time talking all about that notion of rapport and what we know about what builds it and what impedes it. But I would say that we read each other. If we are sensitive and we'll tune in, we get a sense of whether or not the other person is genuinely interested in us, cares about our welfare, has a sort of higher goal than anything. And if they have that, it's felt by the performer. If they're skillful in conveying then the process, great things can happen. So as preamble. Second preamble. Sorry, I have to offer. You were going to ask a question?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you originally, how did you get involved in even thinking about coaching? What are some of the roots of your experience? But if you have another preamble, I'm all up for it.
No, that's fine. I'll describe that. So I started in this process, I think the way many people did. I was teaching at the U.S. Air Force Academy. This was way back when Orville and Wilbur Wright were on the faculty at the Academy. And at that time, there were group dynamics. I taught in the Department of what you would call psychology. We called it behavioral science and leadership at the academy. And emerging on the scene in the late 70s were all sorts of practices around team dynamics and group work. And emerging was something called team building. Believe it or not, it really hadn't existed as a practice prior to that time. So team building came on the scene, and actually at the Air Force Academy, we created one of the very first processes and models for doing team building, which we called squadron relationship and squadron relationship and something training. It was to start team and relationship training. That was it. Squadron team and.
Hey, Fred, just real quick, because I'm also pretty involved in the whole team building world. Yeah. What year was that? When? And sorry to date you, but it'll be interesting for my team building colleagues about learning a little bit more about that.
This was 1978. And in 1978, we really didn't have models of team building to look at. And so we were creating and experimenting with a lot. And we used the Cadet Squadrons as though they were businesses. And of course, they very much are businesses. And each is about 100 cadets. They have composed of each of the 4 classes, but they have very specific things that they have to do in terms of work. And they're ranked against each other. One squadron is number 1 and one squadron is number 40. And so there are lots of very definitive measures of whether or not they are effective as organizations. Set up for a behavioral scientist, because you could see very clearly how they did, and being equal, which is always hard to control, of trying interventions with them. Realized right away was the importance of leadership in that process. Advising what you might call coaching the squadron commander and the squadron leadership staff with their team, squadron, their organization, in lifting the performance. The origin of coaching, I'd say, in addition where people would call the Department of Psychology, base commanders, hospital commanders, military police commanders, and say, I'm having a problem with my unit. Could you send someone? And often they sent me. And so I started people and then advising commanders who were much older, more experienced than I at that point in my life. But you might call that a form of coaching as well. But I think a more interesting question than how I got involved in this, because I think many people followed that path, the one I just described. They started working with organizations on effectiveness and then teams, and then they got in conversation, and those conversations can be of a coaching nature to help people improve performance. Leadership performance was the primary focus then. But if we go a little farther back in history, the first written story in history, which is the Odyssey. Embedded in the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus going off to the Trojan War to fight for Greece and its honor, for Athens specifically. And he leaves Penelope, his beautiful wife, and his son Telemachus back behind him. And trouble ensues because he's delayed by Poseidon for more than 10 years getting back after winning the extended war. And so many suitors, because Penelope's extraordinarily beautiful, come to try to woo Penelope. This is a concern to young Telemachus, and he's at odds end trying to figure out what to do about this. An old friend of Odysseus comes to Telemachus to offer advice, or you might say coaching. But it's actually not this old friend, whose name is Mentor, a goddess of wisdom and, interestingly, strategic warfare. That's who Athena was. She was goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare a fascinating thing in a hugely patriarchal society. So what happens is that she takes the guise of mentor and starts to speak or coach young Telemachus. And then he takes some very wise steps after this coaching process. This is the first recorded coaching or mentoring in the world. Now, those terms, mentoring and coaching, are really interesting. It'd be fun for us to talk another time about the difference in mentoring and coaching, but I'll leave you with a short thought about mentoring and coaching, and that is, I think that you can coach without mentoring, but I don't think you can mentor without coaching. And so perhaps another time we could talk about that as well. So then going on from this, I would say my experience specifically with the coaching model should start with one more caveat, and that is, why a coaching model at all? Why have it? And it's to systematize and structure the conversation so that it moves from interesting to productive. I'd say that's the reason for having a coaching model, to make it systematic, to ensure that it's productive, again, in service of helping the person being coached to get better results on a consistent basis. So if that's the basis, then having structure for the conversation really matters, so that it's more than just an interesting exchange. And
hey,
more,
Fred, just real quickly,
sure.
What I'm really curious about the interesting versus productive piece of that. Is there anything that really showed you that, like, a lot of what we're supposed to be coaching conversations were just interesting conversations rather than productive? What kind of spurred that thought?
I think it was because more of them were failures. More of my efforts were failures than successes when I started. And I think, like many coaches, I fell into the trap of saying, you know, back when I was doing this, when I was an aircraft commander and had all these, was the president of Motorola University, or when I was, and people have about 5 minutes for your war stories about the good old days of what you did. It's the trap that many coaches fall into, of thinking that coaching is about them instead of about the person being coached. And so I think frustration and failure in those conversations where people would essentially say, really great to talk with you today, and they would find a way to move away, that I realized, this is not working as well as I like. And so I also then, because I'm interested in virtually anything, you can see I have an interest in Greek mythology and lots of other topics, is that I can easily become sidetracked and go down bunny trails of interesting parts of conversation that really don't lead to something that is useful in terms of the specific task at hand. And so as a consequence, having structure is as much for the coach as it is for the person being coached. And then I think finally that moving from interesting to productive means having a systematic process that's tested and proven, and that if followed and used skillfully, again, helps the person get great results. That's the measure. We measure whether or not coaching is effective by whether or not you're getting consistently that behavior is actually changing, and that the results the person is getting with changed behavior are improved over what they were before. That's what I would say is productive. Make sense? Whoops.
No, I'm good. That makes total sense. I was muted just so I didn't step on you at all with that. So go back and tell me a little bit about the kind of the models that you started to work with and create early on.
Sure. So the early models, for instance, at the Air Force Academy with squadron team and relationship training, were really based around Beckhart's model of the future state, the current state, and the path forward. And so if you think about this very simple model, I think it's still a very powerful and great model of getting the person to identify what is it that you want, And then to become very clear about what is it that you have, how do those two differ, and then start to create a path forward. And I'd say I was also really influenced by Kurt Lewin, the great American-German psychologist. All change efforts to get better results operate in a field of forces. And you have driving forces and you have restraining forces. I think brilliantly, one of his most remarkable contributions, Kurt Lewin's most remarkable contributions, was the observation that if you have to choose between reducing the restraining forces or adding driving forces, you should always reduce restraining forces. And the reason I think that is so brilliant is because if you think about an analogy, you could be in a car and you've got a brake and a gas pedal. And you can, if you've got one foot on the brake, you can add gas until you're out of gas or you burn the engine up. But unless you release the brake, you can't make forward progress. And so, you know, those two simple ideas, Richard Beckhart's idea of future state, current state, path forward, and then in choosing the path forward, Kurt Lewin's idea of releasing or minimizing the restraining forces. And then, of course, helping the driving forces. This is the argument I have with all the people who say that we should simply focus on what's right instead of what's wrong. I think that there's some logic in that. I think it's exaggerated. The whole positive psychology movement that Seligman started, I'm a huge fan of that. I think that he did a great service to us because for years and years in psychology, we're preoccupied with disease and what's wrong with people. Flip and go all of it, that we should simply build on people's strengths instead of trying to remove the restraining forces that keep them from, help them remove the forces that keep them as they might. I think that's a big loss because I think Kurt Lewin's brilliance was unquestioned. And in my experience, when you can genuinely help a person make what is unconscious conscious, which Jung said is the key. He said that unless you can make the unconscious more conscious, then you will be driven by that unconscious and you will call it fate. And I think that's the case. And so helping people to uncover and see, what's restraining me? How can I remove those forces? And then move all my energies to get what it is that is that I desire a better result. So,
yeah, Fred, the idea of I am a big fan of positive psychology and strength-based approaches to performance, and I was wrestling with this because as a athletic coach and a former athlete, you always in practice and development you focused on the things that were holding you back, and weaknesses is what you focused on in practice, but you would always game plan towards your strengths.
Yes.
And if we're about developing people and coaching people, we've got to bring up those restraining factors, as you call them, so that they can overcome those, but also help them attach and figure out what their strengths are so they can perform. When asked to perform, they can lean on those strengths.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's not an either or. This is a both and question. If we ignore a person's strength, we miss a great opportunity by helping them leverage what works for them and how to use that more effectively. But again, I guess I would point out the old adage, a strength overused becomes a considerable liability or weakness. And so the fact is a person may have brilliant thinking and that they're excellent ideator, and they just shut everyone in the room down with their ideation and brilliance. And when it's overused, it's no longer a strength; it's a liability.
Yeah, it definitely gets in the way, and it goes back to what you were talking about: interesting conversations versus productive conversations. How often have I, in a coaching conversation, really focused on a problem that I had previously and how I solved it, rather than helping understand the performer's current situation and helping them gain capacity to work through it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a trap that we all fall in. Well, in the progression, in my own progression, I worked for several years at the Pecos River Learning Center, where a brilliant ideator and speaker and wild creative talent, Larry Wilson. I had the chance to work closely with Larry over several years, and Larry used the analogy, which is closer to a model that you created, John. And he talked about the Pecos River. In fact, the symbol of Pecos River Learning Center, river itself. So on our caps and on our T-shirts and on our jackets, you would see something look like a curve or a bend in the river. And that bend in the river was where eddies created, where the flow of the Pecos slowed down and it created a smooth water. So you'd have white water and smooth water. And Larry loved leadership as being water. That today, contemporaneously, many people have picked up the idea of VUCA, of volatility and confusion or complexity and ambiguity, that we live in that sort of environment. And Larry's idea was that we should come to Pecos River and that we should take time out before we re-enter the white water. That
eddy out for my white watering friends, you eddy out in order to rest and also scout the next section.
That's right, eddy out. And so the model that we used was one of reflection, of getting people to reflect. And, you know, adding that to what we talked about, future state, current state, path forward, restraining forces, driving forces, minimizing the restraining forces and helping the driving forces. The thing that Larry really helped me see was the importance of reflection. So it's when thinking then, when he loved to say that the real task is to learn how to learn, or to think about what we think about. And because that drives our behavior. And so that step of reflection became very important, that a person being coached, that a performer, as I like to call them, have the time to reflect, consider what's working and what isn't working, to think about history, consider what they really want, think about whether or not that's the actual objective that would be worth pursuing. And so leaving Pecos, I joined a group of friends, one of whom, Bill Murray, had been the founder of the Covey Leadership Centers, and Alan Fine, who came from England, and he was a tennis professional, teaching tennis teacher. And the three of us formed a little company called Inside Out. And Alan brought with him something that John Whitmore, Sir John Whitmore, I don't know the full story of who helped John, Alan, and others grow. Many people in the U.S. would be familiar with GROW model, and the G stands for setting the goal, the reality of the current situation. The A is, the options to deal with that reality. And the W then is, I believe, at the
way forward, or
which way originally. I think it was the question mark, which way, and then it became way forward after that. And we used it successfully, and we used athletic analogies because all of us had been very involved in elite athletics for some time. And after leaving Inside Out and going on, I looked for something further that would integrate all the things that I had experienced prior to that. And I created, actually, you know, to say I created is not really correct. I observed. The model that I created, FACT, is really nothing more than the scientific approach. And the scientific approach, to dumb it way down, is you start with a hypothesis, and then you identify how could I test that hypothesis. You set it up so you can have an experimental group and a group that you hold as the other, and you compare the use of your hypothesis, your approach to testing to that, and then you gather data about what the results are with the two groups, reframe and retest, and you keep moving. Great about the scientific method is the idea of measurement and the idea of testing and refinement, of continual testing and refinement, and letting the results really speak. And so in creating the FACT model, I firmly believe, it's been my experience and observation, that the important part is not in the F, framing, or although that is very important to frame the issue properly, or in the A, it's the articulation and assessment of alternatives, which is critical. Einstein's famous, what's attributed to Einstein, I'm not certain that it really was his definition of insanity, is continuing to do what you do and expecting different results. So testing alternatives that are different, and then getting real commitment is the C. So framing, alternatives, commitment. But then the final step is T, which is tracking progress. And if this is about getting ready results, that T is the most important aspect of coaching. And it builds on the ongoing relationship. As I said, good coaching is about a relationship. And so having a trusting and a productive relationship where we are honest with each other about what's working and what isn't, and we're open to better ways of trying, and we then come up with new alternatives to test and measure, become the real acid test of whether or not this is working. So that's
Fred, when you talk about tracking, and this is where, in my experience in working with the different models, the misunderstanding around tracking is that it's like tracking like a hunter. The coach follows the trail of results until he gets the performer in their sights, and then shoots them down with evidence of poor performance. And that's where I've seen people turn this elegant model of grow or fact into a very cold and calculated, bi-weekly coaching interaction with a spreadsheet tracker. Tell me a little bit about how, and again, we all know that tracking phase is so important, but what about your models or your approach makes it so different than the hunter version?
Yeah, well, I would say tracking, like hunting an animal, versus tracking progress with a performer, the difference is vast. So, I mean, it goes back to the beginning with rapport about what's the real intention, and who is this about? Is this about me? About you, the performer? So the real key to tracking progress is learning. If there is one thing that I observe separates successful people from unsuccessful people, is successful people try things, fail or succeed, but boy, they never waste an experience. They learn. You are an expert in experiential learning. Sure that you observe that some people have an experience and they suck the marrow out of the bones of that experience, and other people go, experience, what else you got for me? Let's do the next game.
Yeah, the T.S. Eliot quote, they had the experience but missed the meaning.
Yeah, that's right. So it's about meaning making in tracking progress and real openness. And so this is where relationship matters deeply. Because if you haven't established a relationship of trust where people have a real openness to explore what worked, what didn't, and why, and see their own part in that. I mean, most of us, me included, human beings, like to point to others and say, well, if they did that or what. So blame of others or shirking responsibility, or inability to look at my own behavior, that's always a restraining factor. I mean, that's a generically restraining factor. So the question in the tracking progress is, can we be open enough to see what I am doing that is restraining me from getting the results? And am I courageous enough? Am I willing to take that on, to try to change that, knowing that behavior change is the hardest thing that any person does? Daniel Kahneman speak recently. 2% behavior change is genuinely significant. 2% change.
I think that's so important what you just said, because for some reason we enter into change, personal or professional change, thinking that, man, we're going to grade this just like a class. So if you have less than a 70% change, you're failing. You're in that D range. And it's just what you said was so crucial just to help us calibrate what effective change really looks like.
Yeah, I think small change makes a huge difference. And that one of the ways we fail in coaching is by thinking the change has to be a huge step change instead of small increments. You know, I would say instead of raise the bar, lower the bar. Bar to realistic but stretch objective for the change. So, you know, the number one New Year's resolution, here we are in January, number one New Year's resolution by a vast percentage is I'm going to lose weight in the new year. I mean, 56% is one statistic I've heard. 56% of New Year's resolutions are about losing weight. And the favorite number, the most average number that people set is 30 pounds. Now, losing 30 pounds of human body fat is a huge endeavor. I mean, we know from the science that if you just ate at base metabolic rate, at BMR, and you ran 17 miles a day, that in 55 days, you'd have achieved your objective because you burn in a mile. That's pretty generic. I mean, it can be slightly more, slightly less. But the idea of for this 350 miles and eating at base metabolic rate, and it's just crazy. I mean, it's a crazy thing. And so January in fitness centers, because they're just packed to the gills. You can't get a shower. You can't get a machine. You have to wait in line for everything. It's crowded and dirty. Don't worry, February's coming. They're going to be empty. And I think the reason that that's true is because people set overly ambitious goals for change, very discouraged and say, see, nothing works. I told you, nothing works. It's just hugely unrealistic. I'd say finally about behavior change that, wow, accountability to another. And that's what tracking is about as well. It's not about rigid accountability, like I'm holding you and I'm grading you and you're going to either fail or succeed. It's accountability of I'm with you. I'm with you in this endeavor. We're going to logic through this. We're going to work on the thinking through it together. We're going to reflect together. And I'm with you. And I'm willing to contribute ideas, but I'm more interested in your ideas.
Another piece that you have there is this idea changing the feelings that go along with accountability. People fear accountability because it will point out their failure. But as we start thinking about mindset, Carol Dweck and some of her thoughts around that, if we can change accountability towards pointing to next steps, and I've always looked at the tracking in my experiential learning aspect of it. Tracking is where the learning happens. The experience all comes as you work through your solution, but you don't learn anything until you step back, reflect, breathe, and have a thought partner work with you through what just happened, what worked, what didn't. So those are—
And you said the magic word, partnership. So changing accountability from reporting to an authority to partnership with someone who will think and work with me and who is in my corner. One of the proud moments of my life was my pretty terrible boxing career at the Air Force Academy. I was not a good boxer, but I was selected by my squadron to be the sacrificial lamb and box for the honor of my squadron, which was a great honor to be selected to box for your squadron. And I was uniformly poor at it. I'm afraid I didn't. Great about boxing was having a corner man. somebody who was there in the corner when you were out there just and going at it up, and you came back and they gave you water and took your mouthpiece out and put the towel over you and wiped the blood off your face so you could get back out in the ring. And that was incredibly important, having a cornerman, because oftentimes what we're engaged in feels like a fight. It isn't, but in our primitive reptilian brain, it feels like a fight, to those fight or flight responses. And simply having someone in our corner who helps us calm down and see with clearer perspective, because it's all about perspective. It's about accuracy. And so a coach helps a person gain more accurate, more precise perspective about the situation they face, the alternatives that they've got to deal with that framed up, and to have the courage to commit to new behavior, to new action.
Yeah, and that that partnership, that corner person, if you don't have somebody else to look at the situation and yourself, you'll never discover the blind spots. You'll never know what you don't know, because by the nature of perception, we can only see what's within our purview. But if you have somebody else to help prompt you to think differently about your behavior, your performance, all of a sudden you have this opportunity to see differently and respond differently.
In teaching at Kellogg, I always put people in learning pairs. Virtually every class I teach, I put people in learning partnerships, and then have them maintain this relationship of accountability throughout the semester or throughout the time frame, where they're helping each other learn and grow and reflect. And my rough observation is that learning is vastly different. I'd say 90% more effective when they have an effective partner and they maintain an effective partnership versus trying a solo change.
Yeah, and we experimented with all that, and a lot of always creating some sort of group experience around the learning. And whether it's 2 people, we like to do 3 people, just so that you have more likely having diverse opinions and thoughts in that. So important when we're doing learning events to create that team perspective, so you can leverage that after the actual event.
Absolutely.
So there's so many things that we could continue to talk about, and so many topics to explore. You mentioned several resources of models and things like that. I'm going to put those in the information section of this video, so people who watch this later on can link to those things. Sure. And this has been such a great kind of taste of the type of conversations that we're going to have in the future in these live broadcasts. So with that, I want to leave a little bit hanging for next time. So Fred, thank you so much for the time that you've taken and for the information and the experience that you've given us. I look forward to what happens next. Be sure to subscribe and follow Growing People Podcast. And Fred, I want to give you one last opportunity to share just maybe a minute or two on what motivates you. If you had to do it in a sentence, what motivates you to be thought partners with people?
Well, it's a huge honor. I often say when you are coaching someone else, you're on sacred ground, because if it works right, they're revealing their innermost workings to you. And that is pretty special. When someone trusts you enough to talk with you in a very factual basis about their dreams and aspirations, about their fears and anxieties, about what they hope for, what they fear, that is pretty sacred ground. And the chance to be of service to people, to help them grow, and then observe that happen a lot of the time, not all of the time, but a lot of the time, see great change and great results from them. Wow, what a high. That is pretty exciting stuff. It in the morning to do the things I do, and I feel really fortunate. Someone described heaven as doing work you love with people you love in places you love, and often that's the case for me. And so I'd say it's heaven.
Well, Fred, thanks again. I am so excited for our next conversation. For you, if you're watching this one, subscribe to the channel and look for the next scheduled live feed, Growing People and Conversations with Fred Harburg. So have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, John. So long, though.